Imagine a nation tearing itself apart, brothers fighting brothers, fields soaked in blood, and a question that would decide the fate of millions. Could a country built on freedom survive its own contradictions? From shocking battles to heroic generals, from staggering losses to moments that changed history forever. This is the untold story of the Civil War, its causes, its battles, and the events that shaped America. Stay with us, because what you're about to witness will challenge everything you thought you knew about this defining conflict. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. Tonight, we step into the fire, not just the fire of battle, but the fire of a nation tearing itself apart. The fire of a nation tearing itself apart. This is the story of the American Civil War, a conflict born from ideology, hardened by politics, and baptized in blood, a war fought between brothers, a war that would decide whether a nation conceived in liberty could survive its own contradictions. The gathering storm, 1820-1860, the seeds of war were planted decades before the first shot was fired. From the Missouri Compromise of 1820 to the Compromise of 1850, America tried again and again to postpone the inevitable. Each compromise was a fragile bandage over a widening wound. At the center of it all was slavery. The industrial North and the agrarian South had grown into two different worlds. The North moved toward wage labor, factories, and immigration. The South depended on plantation agriculture and enslaved labor. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed new territories to decide the slavery question through popular sovereignty, violence erupted. Bleeding Kansas became a rehearsal for a far greater tragedy. Then came the 1860 presidential election. When Abraham Lincoln, a candidate who opposed the expansion of slavery, won without carrying a single Southern state, the South saw the writing on the wall. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded. 10 more states would follow. They formed the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis. The Union was broken. The war begins, 1861. The war officially began on April 12, 1861. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. 34 hours later, the fort surrendered. But the meaning was thunderous. President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. What many believed would be a 9-0-day conflict would become 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter. First blood, first battle of Bull Run. In July 1861, Union forces marched confidently toward Manassas, Virginia. Politicians and civilians followed with picnic baskets a spectacle. They witnessed a nightmare. Confederate General Thomas stood firm as his brigade held the line. The Union Army retreated in chaos. The illusion of a short war died that day. Total war and turning points, 1862, 1863. By 1863, the war had spread across vast fronts, from Virginia to the Mississippi River. At Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17, 1862, more Americans died in a single day than on any other day in U.S. history. 23,000 casualties. Fields turned red. But strategically, it gave Lincoln the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war from a struggle to preserve the Union into a moral crusade against slavery. The world was watching. European powers hesitated to support a Confederacy, now openly tied to human bondage. Then came July 1863, the war's great pivot. At Battle of Gettysburg, Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched a daring invasion of the North. For 3 days, over 160,000 men clashed. Cannon fire shook the earth. On July 3rd, Pickett's charge sent thousands of Confederate soldiers across open fields into devastating Union fire. Lee's army would never fully recover. Almost simultaneously, in the West, Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg on July 4, 1863. The Mississippi River fell into Union hands. The Confederacy was split in two deferis, faintly for the Union. War without mercy, 1864, 1865. By 1864, the war had become brutal and relentless. Grant, now commanding all Union armies, understood the grim arithmetic of total war. He would not retreat. In Virginia, the Overland Campaign brought horrific casualties at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. Meanwhile, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia. His march to the sea cut a fiery path from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying railroads, supplies, and Southern morale. War had moved beyond soldiers. It now consumed entire societies. The final days, 1865. By spring 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted. Richmond fell on April 3rd. Richmond fell on April 9th, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse. Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses surrendered to Ulysses surrendered to Ulysses surrendered to Ulysses. No triumphant parade. Just two weary generals in a quiet room. The war was over. But the cost was staggering: 630,000 to 720,000 to 750,000 Americans were dead. Cities burned. And just 5 days later, President Lincoln was assassinated. President Lincoln was assassinated. The man who had held the Union together would not live to heal it. What caused it? The Civil War was not caused by one event. It was born of slavery and its expansion into new territories, in economic and cultural differences between North and South states' rights versus federal authority, political failures and broken compromises, and the election of 1860, which exposed an unbridgeable divide. But at its heart, it was about human freedom, about whether a republic could endure half slave and half free. The legacy, the American Civil War, reshaped the Constitution, abolished slavery through the 13th Amendment, and redefined citizenship. But it also left scars, political, racial, emotional, that would echo for generations, It proved that democracy is not self-sustaining. It must be defended at terrible cost. This was not just a war of generals and strategy. It was a war of farmers, immigrants, laborers, and enslaved men who seized their freedom by fighting for it. It was a war of ideals. Imperfect, unfinished, but fiercely contested. And in the smoke of Gettysburg, in the surrender at Appomattox, in the graves that stretch across silent fields, we are reminded nations are not destroyed only by enemies from without, by enemies from without. Sometimes they are tested from within. And whether they survive depends on what they are willing to fight for. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join C Space of Presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Long before the first cannon roared over Fort Sumter in 1861, the American Republic was already divided in spirit. The fracture did not begin with gunfire. It began in law books, in cotton fields, in factories choked with smoke, and in the uneasy silence between two regions that no longer recognized themselves in each other. Between 1820 and 1860, the United States expanded westward at breathtaking speed, but every new acre of land reopened the same burning question. Would slavery go with it, or would freedom claim the frontier? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the first major attempt to calm the storm. Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, Maine as a free state, and an invisible line was drawn across the Louisiana Purchase territory. North of it, slavery would be barred. South of it, permitted. For a moment, the nation convinced itself that balance had been restored. But the compromise was not a solution. It was an agreement to delay confrontation. Beneath the surface, the North and South were drifting apart economically and culturally. The North's economy was diversifying, textile mills in Massachusetts, railroads spreading across New York and Pennsylvania, waves of immigrants arriving to work for wages rather than in bondage. The South's wealth remained rooted in land and enslaved labor, especially after the invention of the cotton gin made cotton king in global markets. Cotton tied the South to international trade, particularly with Britain's textile industry. Enslaved people became the backbone of a system that generated immense profits for plantation owners. By the 1850s, cotton accounted for more than half of American exports. The Southern elite saw slavery not as a temporary necessity, but as an essential foundation of their social order. They defended it not only as an economic institution, but increasingly as a positive good, arguing that it provided stability and hierarchy in a rapidly changing world. Meanwhile, in the North, abolitionist voices grew louder. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches denounced slavery as a moral evil incompatible with the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. The Compromise of 1850 again attempted to hold the Union together. California entered as a free state. In return, the South received a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, requiring citizens, even in free states, to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people. Federal marshals could compel ordinary Northerners to participate in the enforcement of slavery. For many in the North, this law shattered any comfortable distance from the institution. Slavery was no longer confined to distant plantations. It could reach into northern cities and demand complicity. Resistance intensified. Underground networks expanded. Courtrooms became battlegrounds of conscience. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act overturned the Missouri Compromise line and introduced the doctrine of popular sovereignty, allowing settlers in new territories to decide the slavery question for themselves. What followed was not peaceful democracy, but violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, determined to shape its future. Ballot boxes were stuffed, towns were burned, armed militias clashed. Bleeding Kansas became a grim preview of civil war, proving that compromise had given way to confrontation. The idea that Americans could settle their deepest moral disagreement through ballots rather than bullets seemed increasingly fragile. Political parties fractured under the strain. The old Whig Party collapsed. A new political force, the Republican Party, emerged in the mid-1850s on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery into the territories. Its rise reflected a profound shift. Opposition to slavery's spread was no longer a fringe position, but a powerful political movement. In the South, fears deepened that Northern majorities would use federal power to restrict and eventually destroy the Southern way of life. The Supreme Court's 1857 decision in the Dred Scott case intensified the crisis, ruling that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories and declaring that African Americans could not be citizens. Instead of settling the issue, the decision outraged the North and emboldened the South, widening the constitutional chasm. At the heart of this sectional division was a fundamental disagreement over the meaning of the Union itself. Was the United States a single nation, indivisible and supreme over the states, or was it a voluntary compact among sovereign states, each retaining the right to withdraw if its interests were threatened? Southern leaders increasingly embraced the doctrine of states' rights, arguing that federal authority had limits and that secession was a legitimate remedy against perceived tyranny. Northern leaders, while divided in their approaches, largely defended the permanence of the Union and the supremacy of federal law. Cultural differences reinforced political ones. The North was becoming more urban, more industrial, more connected by rail and telegraph. Public education expanded. Reform movements flourished, from temperance to women's rights. The South remained more rural, more hierarchical, its social structure dominated by a planter aristocracy that wielded enormous political influence. While most Southern whites did not own enslaved people, the institution shaped every aspect of Southern life, from labor systems to racial ideology. Any threat to slavery felt like a threat to social order itself. By the late 1850s, trust between sections had eroded almost completely. Each side viewed the other not merely as a political opponent, but as an existential danger. To many in the North, the slave power seemed to control national politics, bending laws and courts to protect human bondage. To many in the South, Northern abolitionism appeared radical and destabilizing, intent on inciting rebellion and dismantling their society. Speeches in Congress grew venomous. Physical violence even erupted on the Senate floor when Representative Preston Brooks assaulted Senator Charles Sumner over an anti-slavery speech, an incident that symbolized the collapse of civil discourse. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 crystallized decades of tension. Lincoln did not campaign on immediate abolition where slavery already existed, but he opposed its expansion. For many Southerners, that was enough. His victory, achieved without carrying a single Southern state, convinced them that they had lost control of the federal government. The political balance that had once maintained uneasy peace had vanished. Secession conventions convened. Ordinances were drafted. The Union that had survived foreign invasion and internal compromise now faced its greatest trial. The Union that had survived foreign invasion and internal compromise now faced its greatest trial, born not from sudden rage, but from 40 years of unresolved conflict over slavery, power, identity, and the very meaning of freedom. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to join Thea's space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. The election of 1860 did not simply change political leadership. It shattered the fragile illusion that the United States could indefinitely postpone its reckoning. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency in November 1860, he carried every Northern state but not a single Southern one. To many in the South, this was not merely a political defeat. It was proof that their voice in the federal government had been overwhelmed by a rapidly growing North. The Republican Party, founded on opposition to the expansion of slavery into the territories, now held the highest office in the land. Though Lincoln repeatedly stated he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, Southern leaders saw the long-term trajectory. If slavery could not expand, they believed it would eventually wither. And if it withered, so too would the economic and social system upon which their world depended. South Carolina acted first. South Carolina acted first. On December 20th, 1860, its delegates unanimously voted to secede from the Union. The ordinance declared that the compact between the state and the United States was dissolved. Within weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. By February 1861, 7 states had declared their independence. They formed a new government, the Confederate States of America, and selected Jefferson Davis as their president. A constitution was drafted, closely resembling the U.S. Constitution, but explicitly protecting slavery. The Confederacy was born not in secrecy, but in open defiance, claiming sovereignty and the right to chart its own destiny, Buchanan hesitated. He believed secession was illegal, but also doubted that the federal government had the authority to coerce a state back into the Union. This paralysis deepened the crisis. Federal forts, arsenals, and custom houses across the South were seized by state militias with little resistance. The Union still held a few strategic positions, including a small but significant installation in Charleston Harbor, Fort Sumter. Major Robert Anderson, commanding a small Union garrison, moved his men there. December 1860, after abandoning the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie, the fort quickly became a symbol. For the Confederacy, it represented a foreign military presence in sovereign territory. For the Union, it was a test of federal authority. As Lincoln prepared to take office in March 1861, the crisis deepened. In his inaugural address, he spoke carefully but firmly. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed. Yet he also declared that the Union was perpetual and that secession was legally void. He pledged to hold and possess federal property. There would be no aggression from the Union, he said, unless it was forced upon him. His words sought to reassure and to warn at the same time. But trust had evaporated. Each side suspected the other of preparing for war. The question of Fort Sumter loomed large. The garrison was running low on supplies. Lincoln faced a dilemma: abandon the fort and risk legitimizing secession, or attempt to risk legitimizing secession, or attempt to risk evoking conflict. He chose to send a relief expedition, informing South Carolina authorities that the ships carried food, not weapons. The Confederacy, however, viewed any attempt to reinforce the fort as an act of hostility. On April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate artillery opened fire. Shells arced across the dark sky, exploding against brick walls that had become the final thread binding two nations. For 34 hours, the bombardment continued. Major Anderson's men returned fire, but were hopelessly outgunned. On April 13th, he surrendered. Miraculously, no one was killed in the bombardment itself, yet the political impact was seismic. The attack unified the North in a way that months of debate had not. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress what he described as an insurrection. The response was swift and overwhelming. Men poured into recruiting stations, driven by patriotism, outrage, and a belief that the Union must be preserved at all costs. But Lincoln's call for troops pushed four more states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, into secession. They could not accept sending soldiers to fight fellow Southerners. The Confederacy now stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. Richmond, Virginia, became its capital, symbolically closer to Washington and the looming battlefield. Communities fractured almost overnight. Families found themselves divided, with brothers and cousins choosing different allegiances. In border states like Kentucky and Missouri, loyalties were bitterly contested. Even in Maryland, just miles from the nation's capital, riots erupted as Southern sympathizers clashed with Union troops. The conflict was no longer theoretical. It was immediate and personal, militias drilled in town squares. Newspapers printed fiery editorials. Railroads transported regiments toward uncertain futures. Both sides believed the war would be brief. Northern politicians predicted a swift suppression of rebellion. Many Southerners believed their martial spirit and defensive position would secure independence quickly. Few imagined the scale of suffering that lay ahead. In July 1861, Union forces marched toward Manassas Junction in Virginia, where Confederate troops gathered. Civilians from Washington traveled out to watch, expecting spectacle rather than slaughter. The clash that followed, known as the First Battle of Bull Run, shattered illusions on both sides. When Confederate reinforcements arrived and held firm under General Thomas, the Union line collapsed. The retreat turned into chaos as soldiers and civilians alike fled toward Washington. The defeat forced the North to confront reality. This would not be a short conflict. It would demand massive mobilization, industrial strength, and sustained resolve. In the pulled South, victory at Bull Run fueled confidence, but also hardened commitment. The die had been cast. Diplomacy gave way to mobilization. Railroads clattered with troop movements. Armories worked without rest. The fragile bonds of union had snapped, replaced by two governments preparing for a struggle that would test not only armies but entire societies. The spark ignited at Fort Sumter had become a spreading blaze, fed by decades of mistrust and now sustained by blood and determination. The first great shock of the war came in July 1861, when idealism collided with gunpowder at the First Battle of Bull Run. In the early months after Fort Sumter, many in the North believed the rebellion could be crushed with one decisive blow. Politicians pressured Union commanders to advance on Richmond. Newspapers demanded action. Volunteers, many enlisted for only 90 days, were eager to prove themselves. There was a strange excitement in the air, as though war might be a grand pageant rather than a descent into brutality. Union Brigadier General Irvin McDowell led roughly 35,000 men south toward Manassas Junction, where Confederate forces under Generals P.G.T. Beauregard and Joseph E.G.T. Beauregard and Joseph E.G.T. Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston awaited them. Civilians from Washington packed picnic baskets and rode out in carriages to watch what they assumed would be a swift victory. The morning of July 21st began with confusion and maneuvering through wooded terrain. At first, Union troops pushed the Confederates back. But then reinforcements arrived by rail, one of the first times in history that railroads played such a decisive role in moving troops directly into battle. It was during this clash that General Thomas earned his legendary nickname. As Confederate lines wavered, he stood firm, rallying his brigade with calm determination. A fellow officer reportedly cried out that Jackson stood like a stone wall. The phrase captured the moment. Confederate resistance stiffened. Union coordination faltered. By afternoon, the tide had turned. What began as an orderly retreat became a panicked rout. Soldiers threw away rifles and packs as they fled toward Washington, colliding with terrified civilians who had come to spectate. The road back to the capital became a churning mass of fear and disbelief. Bull Run shattered illusions on both sides. The North realized the Confederacy would not collapse easily. The South learned that courage alone would not end the war quickly. Casualty numbers, around 5,000 combined, were shocking to a public that had imagined glory rather than carnage. The war would not be a 90-day affair. It would demand organization, discipline, and endurance far beyond what anyone had prepared for. As 1861 turned into 1862, the scale of mobilization expanded dramatically. The Union, with its larger population and industrial base, began constructing massive training camps. Factories shifted to war production. Rail networks were coordinated for military logistics. The Confederacy, though more limited in resources, harnessed local knowledge and defensive strategy. Both sides were learning how to fight a modern war, blending Napoleonic tactics with increasingly lethal weaponry, such as rifled muskets and artillery that could kill at greater distances with devastating accuracy. In the Eastern Theater, General George B. McClellan took command of the Army of the Potomac. Brilliant at organization, but cautious in combat, He spent months drilling his troops and preparing for a grand offensive against Richmond. In the spring of 1862, his Peninsula campaign moved Union forces up the Virginia Peninsula toward the Confederate capital. Progress was slow. Skirmishes turned into grinding engagements. Confederate General Robert E. Lee assumed command and launched a series of counterattacks known as the 7 Days Battles. McClellan retreated, convinced he faced overwhelming numbers, though he often overestimated the enemy's strength. Meanwhile, in the West, Union forces achieved significant gains along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Battles at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in early 1862 opened crucial waterways and boosted Northern morale. Yet even as territory shifted, the human cost rose sharply. At Shiloh in April 1862, nearly 24,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing after 2 days of savage fighting. The scale of bloodshed stunned the nation. Fields once quiet with spring growth became scenes of unimaginable suffering. But it was on September 17, 1862, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, that the war revealed its full horror in a single day. The Battle of Antietam remains the bloodiest single day in American military history. Over 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing in roughly 12 hours of combat. The battle unfolded in phases. The cornfield, where lines advanced and fell back repeatedly through stalks shredded by gunfire. The sunken road, later called Bloody Lane, where soldiers fought at such close quarters that the earth itself seemed to bleed, and Burnside's Bridge, where Union troops struggled to cross under withering fire. Lee had carried the war onto Northern soil for the first time, hoping to sway European opinion and perhaps secure foreign recognition for the Confederacy. Instead, though the battle ended tactically inconclusive, Lee was forced to retreat back into Virginia. The Union claimed a strategic victory. President Abraham Lincoln seized the moment. Days later, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in rebelling states would be free as of January 1st, 1863. The war, once framed primarily as a fight to preserve the Union, now took on an explicit moral dimension. Slav, where he was placed at the center of the conflict in unmistakable terms. Antietam's fields were littered with bodies. Photographs taken after the battle, displayed in northern cities, confronted civilians with stark images of death. For the first time, war's reality entered living rooms not as romantic illustration, but as grim documentation. Mothers and wives searched casualty lists with dread. Hospitals overflowed. Surgeons worked without rest, often without adequate anesthesia or sanitation. Disease spread rapidly in camps where thousands of men lived in close quarters. By late 1862, both sides understood that victory would not come cheaply. The early battles had stripped away naivete. The idea of a quick, glorious contest was replaced by grim determination. Armies grew larger. Command structures hardened. Strategies evolved from probing maneuvers into sustained campaigns. Civilians adjusted to shortages, inflation, and the constant anxiety of letters that might never arrive. The war was no longer a distant spectacle or a brief test of wills. It had become a grinding struggle measured not in days but in mounting graves, a conflict that demanded everything. Nations could give and took more than anyone had imagined. By 1863, the American Civil War had reached a turning point that would shape its ultimate outcome. The first 2 years had been marked by uncertainty, fierce battles, and staggering losses, but the momentum of the war began to shift in ways that would redefine both strategy and morale. The events of that year, particularly the battles of Gettysburg and the capture of Vicksburg, illuminated the scale, complexity, and stakes of the conflict. They demonstrated that the war was no longer regional struggle. It had become a test of national endurance, resolve, and identity. In June 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee embarked on a daring invasion of the North. After his campaigns in Virginia, Lee believed that an incursion into Union territory could relieve pressure on the South, disrupt Northern industry, and perhaps even sway foreign governments to recognize the Confederacy. The Army of Northern Virginia, though battered by previous engagements, moved through Maryland and into Pennsylvania with precision. Lee's strategy relied not only on bold tactics, but also on the hope that Northern citizens and states would become disillusioned with the war, eroding support for continued military campaigns. Union forces, under the command of General George G. Meade, were tasked with intercepting Lee's advance. The two armies met at Gettysburg in early July. What followed was 3 days of relentless combat that would come to symbolize the intensity and tragedy of the war. On July 1st, Confederate forces clashed with Union troops northwest of the town. Skirmishes quickly escalated into full-scale engagement as reinforcements poured in from both sides. By nightfall, the Confederates had gained ground, but the Union Army held strong positions on high ridges to the south and east. The second day of the battle, July 2nd, saw repeated Confederate assaults on Union flanks. At places like Little Round Top, Union defenders held desperate positions, repelling waves of attacks with rifle and bayonet. The terrain itself became a strategic asset, with ridges, stone walls, and wooded areas shaping the flow of combat. Soldiers fought in brutal proximity. The cacophony of musket fire, artillery, and shouted commands filled the air, punctuated by the cries of the wounded. Cavalry charges, artillery barrages, and infantry advances created a chaotic mosaic of bravery and carnage. July 3rd, 1863, marked the climax of Gettysburg with Pickett's charge. Thousands of Confederate soldiers advanced across open fields toward fortified Union positions on Sumter. The assault was intended to break the Union center and deliver a decisive blow. Instead, it became a tragic testament to the lethality of modern warfare. Cannon and rifle fire cut down waves of men before they could reach the Union lines. Survivors crawled back across the field, exhausted and bloodied. The failure of Pickett's charge shattered Lee's momentum. The Army of Northern Virginia, despite its courage and discipline, would never fully recover from the losses sustained during those 3 days. While Gettysburg raged in the east, another critical campaign was unfolding in the west. The city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, sat atop high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, controlling one of the most important waterways in the Confederacy. Union General Ulysses S. Grant recognized that capturing Vicksburg would split the Confederacy and secure strategic dominance of the river. Grant's campaign was methodical, involving a combination of maneuvering, siege warfare, and coordinated assaults. Confederate forces, under General John C. Pemberton, were entrenched and well supplied, but Grant's persistent encirclement gradually cut off reinforcements and supplies. By early July 1863, after weeks of bombardment, shortages, and relentless pressure, the Confederate garrison at Vicksburg surrendered. The Mississippi River fell entirely into Union hands. Achieving a long-sought strategic goal, the victory was as symbolic as it was practical. It confirmed Grant's reputation as a determined and capable commander, showcased the effectiveness of coordinated campaigns, and dealt a significant blow to Confederate morale. The twin events of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, occurring almost simultaneously, created a profound shift in the course of the war. These turning points were not only military in nature, they reshaped political and social realities as well. In the North, victories strengthened support for President Abraham Lincoln, and the Union cause. Abolitionists and moderates alike were bolstered by the prospect of success, and the Emancipation Proclamation, issued months earlier, gained renewed legitimacy. The war was increasingly understood as a struggle not merely to preserve the Union, but to confront the moral and political issue of slavery. In the South, the twin setbacks created anxiety and reflection. Confidence in Lee's invincibility was shaken, and the realization set in that the Confederacy could not win through audacity alone. Resource constraints, population disparities, and Union control of critical infrastructure now loomed as formidable obstacles. The battles of 1863 also underscored the human cost of the conflict. Gettysburg left approximately 51,000 soldiers dead, wounded, or missing. Fields and hillsides were strewn with bodies. Hospitals overflowed, and medical personnel struggled with limited supplies, primitive anesthesia, and rampant disease. Vicksburg, while a siege rather than a pitched battle, inflicted suffering on both military and civilian populations. Starvation, disease, and bombardment created desperate conditions within the city's fortifications. Civilians endured shortages of food and medicine, while soldiers faced relentless pressure under siege lines. The experience of these battles shaped military thinking for the remainder of the war. Commanders on both sides recognized the necessity of entrenchments, artillery coordination, and logistical planning. The scale of engagements highlighted the importance of railroads, telegraphs, and supply chains. Warfare had become industrialized, extending beyond individual heroism to encompass strategy, organization, and infrastructure. Both armies adapted to the reality that large-scale, prolonged campaigns were inevitable. Morale, leadership, and communication were equally tested. At Gettysburg, Meade's ability to quickly consolidate Union forces and defend critical terrain prevented a Confederate breakthrough. Lee's audacity, while initially successful in maneuvering, was ultimately countered by tenacious defense and strategic Union positioning. Grant's perseverance at Vicksburg demonstrated the value of attrition, patience, and relentless pressure in overcoming entrenched defenses. These lessons would echo in subsequent campaigns, shaping the conduct of battles and influencing decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of lives. Civilian populations on both sides were profoundly affected. The Union victories gave hope and reinforced the legitimacy of the war effort, while the Southern populace confronted the stark reality that the conflict was far from concluding in their favor. Letters, newspapers, and public speeches reflected a growing consciousness that the war was no longer a series of skirmishes, but a monumental struggle that would determine the survival of the Confederate States and the future of slavery in the United States. Gettysburg and Vicksburg also had international implications. European powers had been watching the conflict closely, weighing the possibility of recognizing the Confederacy or providing aid. Lee's defeat at Gettysburg, combined with the Union's control of the Mississippi River, diminished the plausibility of Confederate success. European leaders became increasingly cautious, recognizing that a divided or collapsed South was less likely to command influence on the global stage. The Union's strategic victories reinforced the message that the rebellion could be contained and ultimately defeated. The turning points of 1863 thus represented both a military and psychological shift. They demonstrated the importance of planning, coordination, and perseverance while highlighting the cons, sequences of miscalculation and overreach. Soldiers and civilians alike came to understand that the war was entering a phase where endurance, strategy, and moral conviction would determine the outcome. Each army confronted not only the enemy across the field, but also the limits of its own resources, the endurance of its own resources, the endurance of its soldiers. and the expectations of its civilian supporters. These campaigns solidified the emergence of leaders who would dominate the latter stages of the war. Grant's success in the West established him as a commander capable of sustained offensive operations, patient yet unyielding. Lee, despite the setback at Gettysburg, remained a brilliant tactician whose presence inspired the Confederate Army and public alike. Union commanders in the East learned the value of defensive positioning, the integration of intelligence, and the importance of rapid communication. The lessons of 1863 would guide decisions, shape morale, and influence the trajectory of engagements that followed, setting the stage for the final campaigns that would decide the fate of the nation. By 1864, the American Civil War had entered its most relentless and destructive phase, a period defined by total war and unflinching strategy. The Union, under the leadership of Ulysses S.S. Grant, had grown more aggressive, willing to trade blood for strategic advantage, and determined to crush the Confederate resistance through sustained campaigns. Grant, recently appointed General-in-Chief of all Union armies, understood that the Confederacy could not endure a prolonged attritional strategy, unlike earlier commanders who had sought limited engagements or cautious maneuvers. Grant embraced the reality that the South's armies, infrastructure, and civilian morale had to be systematically targeted in order to bring the war to a decisive conclusion. In Virginia, the Overland Campaign unfolded as a endless series of clashes between Grant's forces and the Army of Northern Virginia, commanded by General Robert E. Lee. Beginning in May 1864, Grant advanced south from the Rapidan River, forcing Lee into continuous defensive action. Battles at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor epitomized the brutal nature of this new strategy. The Wilderness, with its dense underbrush and chaotic terrain, became a nightmarish theater where visibility was limited and coordination nearly impossible. Soldiers fought in near constant proximity, with musket and artillery fire, creating confusion, fear, and staggering casualties. Lee's skillful use of defensive positions inflicted heavy losses on Union troops, but Grant refused to retreat, understanding that the Confederates could not replace men as easily as the North. Spotsylvania brought further evidence of the war's grinding intensity. Over 2 weeks, lines shifted back and forth, with assaults on fortified positions resulting in horrific casualties. The Mule's Shoe Salient, a protruding section of Confederate defenses, became the focal point of repeated Union attacks. The soil itself seemed soaked with blood as soldiers climbed over each other in the chaos, driven by orders and desperation. Cold Harbor in June 1864 further illustrated the human cost of frontal assaults against entrenched positions. Thousands of Union soldiers fell within minutes, a reminder that strategy could be measured in lives as much as in territory. While the Eastern Theater consumed attention, the Western Theater witnessed one of the most consequential campaigns of the war: General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea. After capturing Atlanta in September 1864, Sherman turned his army eastward, cutting a swath from Atlanta to Savannah. Unlike earlier campaigns focused primarily on engaging enemy armies, Sherman embraced the doctrine of total war. Railroads, supply lines, warehouses, and crops were systematically destroyed. The goal was not only to defeat Confederate forces, but to break the South's ability to sustain itself, to erode morale, and to demonstrate that resistance was increasingly futile. Civilians witnessed the devastation firsthand. Homesteads and barns burned, livestock slaughtered, and infrastructure dismantled. While Sherman sought to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties, the psychological impact was profound. signaling that the Confederacy's defensive perimeter could not shield its society from the war's reach. Sherman's campaign was also a lesson in mobility, logistics, and psychological warfare. His army moved quickly, living off the land and relying on foraging to sustain itself, minimizing dependence on vulnerable supply lines. This approach allowed him to outpace Confederate forces, who were forced into reactive strategies rather than proactive maneuvers. Each march communicated a clear message: the Confederacy's heartland was no longer inviolate. Resistance would come at a steep cost, not only for armies, but for the population that sustained them. In parallel, Grant's continuous pressure in Virginia forced Lee into defensive operations that stretched Confederate resources thin. Supply shortages became acute, and the South's capacity to replace men, munitions, and provisions lagged behind the Union's industrial and logistical advantages. Grant's strategy accepted heavy Northern casualties as part of the broader objective: attrition of Confederate strength. In this, the philosophy of war had shifted. Victory would not necessarily be achieved in a single battle or through brilliant maneuvers alone. It required endurance, sustained pressure, and an understanding that the Confederacy could be systematically exhausted. Political considerations also shaped the campaigns of 1864. Lincoln faced re-election amid war fatigue in the North, with public opinion divided over the human cost of continued fighting. Military successes, particularly Sherman's capture of Atlanta, bolstered Northern morale and reinforced confidence in Lincoln's leadership. These victories strengthened the legitimacy of his administration and the Union war effort, demonstrating that strategy and politics were inseparable in a conflict of such magnitude. The battlefield, in effect, became a theater where military outcomes could influence elections, diplomacy, and public sentiment. Meanwhile, the Confederacy faced mounting challenges. Southern civilians, while committed to the cause, experienced food shortages, inflation, and the disruption of everyday life. Men conscripted into armies left gaps in agricultural production, exacerbating scarcity. Infrastructure damage, compounded by Union raids and sieges, limited mobility and supply distribution. Lee's army, though tactically brilliant and highly motivated, faced the cumulative effects of attrition and exhaustion. Each engagement depleted resources that could not easily be replenished, highlighting the strategic importance of industrial and logistical superiority. The combined impact of Grant and Sherman's campaigns illustrated the evolution of warfare into a total enterprise encompassing economy, infrastructure, and civilian morale alongside battlefield victories. Soldiers endured long marches, relentless engagement, and the constant threat of death or injury. Commanders had to weigh risk against long-term objectives, knowing that individual battles, while tactically important, were part of a larger campaign designed to break the enemy's will. The psychological dimension of war became as significant as the physical. The sight of destruction, the inevitability of Union pressure, and the knowledge that no retreat could fully relieve the conflict, all contributed to shaping Southern response. Casualties continued to mount at alarming rates. Battles such as the Wilderness and Cold Harbor inflicted thousands of deaths, with injuries exacerbated by disease and inadequate medical care. Surgeons worked in primitive conditions, often improvising amputations and treating infections with minimal understanding of hygiene. Soldiers faced long periods in camps, exposed to harsh weather, malnutrition, and illness. The war's scope extended beyond immediate combat, affecting every aspect of life in both armies. Families waited anxiously for news, communities strained under the burden of supporting soldiers and coping with loss, and newspapers carried daily reports that both informed and haunted the public. Grant's relentless strategy forced the Confederacy into a defensive posture, limiting opportunities for offensive operations. Lee's tactical skill allowed the Army of Northern Virginia to delay ultimate defeat, but strategic circumstances, numerical inferiority, dwindling supplies, and the Union's industrial advantage meant that the Confederate position was increasingly precarious. In the West, Sherman's destruction of infrastructure and resources accelerated the disintegration of Confederate capacity to wage war effectively. Together, these campaigns demonstrated a comprehensive approach. Victory required more than courage or battlefield brilliance. It demanded systematic pressure, logistical planning, and an understanding of the interdependence between military action, civilian society, and political objectives. Civilian perception played a critical role as well. The Union aimed to convince Southern populations that continued resistance was futile, undermining the moral and psychological foundations of rebellion. Sherman's march exemplified this strategy. As towns burned and railroads were torn apart, Southern civilians came to grasp the extent to which the war had reached their homes, farms, and communities. The message was clear. The Confederate government could not protect its people indefinitely, and survival of the rebellion was increasingly uncertain. The campaigns of 1864 also reflected innovation in military leadership. Grant and Sherman embraced coordination across theaters, leveraging Union superiority in manpower and logistics. Communication between the Eastern and Western armies allowed for synchronized offensives, forcing the Confederacy to defend multiple fronts simultaneously. This operational complexity required disciplined command, careful planning, and adaptability in the face of unexpected developments. Both campaigns underscored the growing importance of integrated strategy, moving beyond isolated engagements to consider the war as a unified national effort. The physical and psychological toll on soldiers and civilians alike cannot be overstated. The relentless pace of the overland campaign, combined with Sherman's destructive march, created an environment where endurance, resilience, and morale were constantly tested. Soldiers faced long marches under fire, exposure to extreme weather, and the uncertainty of combat. Civilians navigated displacement, shortages, and the disruption of local economies. Communities experienced the war not as distant battles, but as a pervasive force shaping every aspect of daily life. Through these campaigns, the Union demonstrated a willingness to embrace the harsh realities of modern, industrialized warfare. The concept of total war, targeting not only enemy armies, but also infrastructure, supply chains, and morale, became a defining feature. Grant's unyielding pressure in Virginia and Sherman's march through Georgia illustrated complementary approaches, one aimed at depleting Confederate manpower and compelling surrender through attrition, the other focused on undermining the logistical and psychological foundations of resistance. Together, they reflected a sophisticated understanding of war as a multidimensional effort that integrated strategy, politics, and social influence. If you stillness in these words, subscribe to Join Therapist Sense and share your deepest now in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.